Moses was a murderer. Christ was a bastard. And Mohammed? Mohammed was a... Mohammed was a...
Hi everyone. That opening clip was of Dr. Jordan B. Peterson. He's a professor at the University of Toronto in the psychology department. And it's from a video response he made back in February to Motion 103 being discussed in Canadian Parliament. As some of you may know, this motion was passed recently, last Thursday, about 4 days ago, and is now one step closer to becoming a reality in Canada. I'd highly recommend you go watch Dr. Peterson's videos. They're very good, very enlightening, I'll say. I felt personally obliged to make a video about this topic because I am a resident of Canada, and this will affect me personally if it goes any further. So to start off, I'm going to be reading a news article from the National Post about the passing of M-103, and then I'm going to give my deeper analysis into this motion. The House of Commons voted Thursday afternoon to condemn Islamophobia and all forms of systemic racism and religious discrimination, but the vote for the controversial M-103 was not unanimous. Liberals, NDP, and Green Party were in favour. Most Conservative and all Bloc Québécois MPs were opposed. It was a free vote, which means MPs did not have to follow the party line, and as such, 2 Conservative MPs voted in favour, one leadership candidate Michael Chong and Ontario MP Bruce Stanton. The motion was proposed by Iqra Khalid, a first-time MP representing Mississauga, Ontario riding. In addition to the resolution condemning Islamophobia, it asked the House of Commons Standing Committee on Canadian Heritage to study the issue of, and I quote, eliminating systemic racism and religious discrimination, including Islamophobia, and calls on the federal government to collect data on hate crimes for further study. Our country is very diverse, Khalid said after the vote. I think that we need to continue to build these bridges amongst Canadians. And this is just one way that we can do this, by really understanding the issues and really listening to what Canadians have to say. I'm really looking forward to the track that the Canadian Heritage Committee takes on this. Alright, so this is all well and good, but what exactly is the content of Motion 103? Now, as you can see here, Motion 103 has 3 subsections, and the third subsection has 2 further subsections in it. Subsection A is the House must recognize the need to quell the increasing public climate of hate and fear. B, condemn Islamophobia and all forms of systemic racism and religious discrimination, and take note of the House of Commons Petition E411 and the issues raised by it. I'll get to that in a minute. And C, request that the Standing Committee on Canadian Heritage undertake a study on how the government could, subsection 1, develop a whole-of-government approach to reducing or eliminating systemic racism and religious discrimination, including Islamophobia, in Canada, while ensuring a community-centered focus with a holistic response through evidence-based policymaking. And 2, collect data to contextualize hate crime reports and to conduct needs assessments for impacted communities, and that the committee should present its findings and recommendations to the House no later than 240 calendar days from the adoption of this motion, provided that in its report, the committee should make recommendations that the government may use to better reflect the enshrined rights and freedoms in the Constitution Acts, including the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. So there's a few questions raised by this. First of all, what is Petition E411? Well, here it is on screen. I'm going to paraphrase it, but basically what it says is Islam is a huge religion. It's affected humans positively over its 1400 years. Recently, there's a very small number of extremist individuals who claim to represent the religion in the name of violence. And this has led to a notable increase in anti-Muslim sentiments in Canada. These violent individuals do not reflect us, and they misrepresent our religion. We categorically reflect all their activities, etc. Now, it ends with, we, the undersigned, citizens and residents of Canada, call upon the House of Commons to join us in recognizing these extremist individuals do not represent us. Okay, that's acceptable. And in condemning all forms of Islamophobia. Alright, so what is Islamophobia? Because this truly is the question. Who determines Islamophobia? What is it? There's no concrete standard for this. The most frequently used one is criticism of Islam. And if that's the case, then I'm sorry, you can't have that kind of law in a secular Western country, or a secular country in general. You can't have that. You can't have blasphemy laws in a secular country. It doesn't make sense. We should be able to criticize religion, any religion, and specifically Islam, because Islam is a very, very regressive religion. The way they treat their citizens in Islamic countries is horrible. And we should be able to criticize these countries in order to learn from them, improve them, or just not make the same mistakes they do. At the cost of sounding facetious and being facetious, what do you think the makeup of the Standing Committee on Canadian Heritage is? What do you think the political leanings of the members are? All right, you have an idea in your head now? Well, here it is right here. Of course, they're all liberal. Now, the reason I object to this is because all of these people they're all members of the House of Commons. These are all MPs. A majority of this committee is liberal. 5 of the 7 members are liberal. The chair is liberal. The 2 vice chairs, one's conservative, one's NDP. So these are the people who have exclusive power to determine how this motion will affect law moving forward. That is the purpose of the motion. The purpose of the motion is to give this committee power to determine what to do moving forward with Islamophobic and systemic racism laws. And these people, these 6 people, are all MPs of the Liberal Party, and they all voted in favor of this bill. These people voted in favor of Islamic blasphemy laws in a secular Western country. Now, people defend this by saying, well, the motion's non-binding. And yes, I realize that. But the motion is just stage 1 of a process that could lead to this becoming law. That is the purpose of the motion. And they voted to make these 6 people, these 6 liberals and 1 NDP, these 7 people voted to make themselves the arbiters of whether or not that this moves forward. They're in charge of whether or not this becomes law, and they all voted in favor of the motion. What do you think that indicates? So, what's my overall opinion on this motion? Well, if you haven't guessed it, I'm very opposed to it. The idea that a Western country can vote this as a motion and hopefully never into law is sickening to me. Now, if you'll allow me a few personal stories here to get my views across. I grew up in a very diverse part of Canada. Growing up, pretty much all my friends were immigrants. And I remember in high school, there was a couple guys I hung around with. There was one who was Afghani apostate. So his family was Muslim, and then they converted to Christianity, and they had to flee the country because they were going to be killed, because that's the punishment in a Islamic system. So the idea now that his family came to Canada for a better place to live, and I know we're not going to vote in Sharia anytime soon, hopefully, but now the idea that he can no longer give his story, and we can no longer say that Islam is a horrible, brutal political idea. The idea that can no longer happen because of this motion, his family, their lives were ruined. His life was almost ended, and he can no longer tell that story because it would be Islamophobic and against the law. Now, another friend I had growing up in high school was who was Baha'i. He was from Iran, and if you guys know anything about Iranian religions, Baha'i it's a really new religion. I think it's only a couple hundred years old, and the Shia hate Baha'i. And religiously, you can understand, because Baha'i, the prophet of Baha'i, says he's the new prophet, and that's obviously against Islam because Mohamed was the last prophet. So they basically kill or discriminate against all Baha'i that they can find in Iran. And of course, his family fled the country. There's a lot of Baha'i in this region. And it's sickening to me because he can no longer tell his story about how his family was discriminated against and almost killed. Same with the Afghani apostate. None of this has any worth anymore in the society that the liberals in the NDP and the Green Party, these guys are trying to build. None of this has any weight anymore because we have to protect the radicals for some reason. Now, I would argue that this is enough for anyone to be against Motion 103. But if you want more proof, consider this. The Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, Section 15, subsection 1 states, "Every individual is equal before and under the law and has the right to the equal protection and equal benefit of the law without discrimination and in particular without discrimination based on race, national or ethnic origin, color, religion, sex, age, or mental or physical handicap. So tell me, if it's against the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which is a pretty important document, if it's already against that document to discriminate based on religion, then why do we need Motion 103? Why do we need another law, another, because this will eventually become a bill. Why do we need another law to prevent Islamophobia if it's already against the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms to discriminate against Muslims? So the only effect that this motion will have is stifling freedom of speech. Because discrimination is very clear what discrimination means. I can't actively work against someone based on their religion. But now I can no longer be Islamophobic. Now, what does Islamophobic mean? Well, it means you're talking poorly about Islam or Muslims. Say it's not even defined. It could be anything. It could be either of those things. It could be both of those things. So now it's no longer, okay, you're Muslim. I don't like you. I'm not going to hire you. Now it's Islam's a bad religion, I think. Oh, well, now I'm in jail. Now, for those of you who may be depressed from everything I've just said, there is some hope. Now, going back to the National Post article, I'll continue reading here. Pollster Angus Reid Institute asked 1,511 Canadians, if you're a member of Parliament, how would you vote on this motion M-103, and found that 42% would vote against it, 29% would vote in favor, and 29% were not sure. So, what does this mean? Well, it means the Canadian people are still sane. Now, 42% isn't a majority of Canadians, but it's enough that if they were voting, it wouldn't have passed. Now, remember the parties that voted for this. All the NDP and all the Liberals voted for this, and the Green Party for all they're worth. And the majority of the Conservatives, pretty much all the Conservatives minus two, and all the Bloc voted against it. Now, how do you think it reflects on the popularity of said parties when the majority of Canadians don't want this to pass, and yet it's unanimously passed by the majority party? Being the Liberals. Well, as you can imagine, it's probably bad for the Liberals. And sure enough, here is a federally weighted polling average that was taken yesterday, March 26th. So, as you can see, the Liberals and NDP are falling, and Conservatives are climbing. And the Bloc is staying the same, but that makes sense because you can only vote for them in Quebec, so barring any large changes in voting, you won't be able to see it on a federally average poll. Now, here are a few graphs that show the exact same data as the numbers I just showed. So at the top, we have the overall Canadian average. The Liberals are just falling. Conservatives are rising, and NDP is actually rising too, a bit. Green Party and Bloc are roughly the same at the bottom. But the interesting thing to me is the separate province breakdown. You can see here, BC is predominantly Liberal, and the Liberals are losing there. Conservatives are trending up slightly. Alberta is always going to be conservative. Saskatchewan and Manitoba for me is really interesting because they're kind of typically swing, but you can see the Conservatives are now leading there. Ontario to me is shocking. Ontario is the most populous province and is by far the most liberal, and Conservatives and Liberals are neck and neck. Quebec is plummeting Liberals, and the Bloc is actually rising. The Bloc is rising faster than the Conservatives, which is kind of shocking to me. Atlantic Canada is going to be predominantly Liberal, but the Conservatives are still rising, the Liberals are still falling. So what does all this mean, really? Well, what does this mean for the future of Canada? What does it mean for Motion 103? Well, for Motion 103, it shows that the parties are willing to go against the popular vote. They're willing to go against what the majority of Canadians want for ideological purposes. So that really doesn't bode well for us. Now, the fact that the majority of Canadians oppose this is really heartening to me, and it shows that I think we're going to win in the long run. I don't want to sound naive, but I really think we'll win in the long run. We just need to go through some dark times, basically. So what does all this really mean for Canada? Well, I think it means the Conservatives are going to win next election. And I say that with a heavy heart. I've voted NDP my whole life, but I don't see any other choice at this point. Now, there's a couple circumstances that could negate this, one of which is Trudeau changing his tune, and I don't think he's going to do that because I don't think he has anything between his ears. I think he's stupid. I think he just does whatever he thinks is popular, whatever is trendy, and he's a complete ideologue. He's not going to change his ideas anytime soon. Another determining factor would be who the Conservatives pick for their leader, because there's a couple good people, there's a couple bad people. It depends for me who they choose, but I think I'm going to have to vote Conservative next election because they're the only ones who are fighting for freedom of speech. I can't vote NDP anymore, and I can't vote Liberal anymore. I have to vote Conservative. And for me personally, I disagree on a lot of Conservative points in Canada. I mean, typically I dislike one-issue voters, but if that issue is freedom of speech, what are you going to do? I can't support blasphemy laws in a secular Western country. In my country, I can't vote for that. Thanks everyone for listening to me rant. I found this video very cathartic for me, just working out my personal feelings on this. But please, let me know your personal feelings. Let me know what you feel about Motion 103, the future of Motion 103, where you think it's going to go. Let me know what you think about the state of Canada right now, frankly, the state of the parties. What do you think is going to happen next election? There's a lot of stuff that this motion has a lot of far-reaching consequences, both directly and indirectly in Canada, and I really want to know what your opinion on it is. If you enjoyed this video, consider giving it a like and a subscribe. If you thought it was informative, maybe try sharing it with your friends or with your enemies. I don't discriminate. As always, thanks for watching, guys. I'll see you next time.